This is Henry Frederick of Headline Surfer, and this is the Roundtable, a weekly discussion of news and public affairs. To my left is Stan Escudero, who writes a blog called The Guidepost, and to my right is Dana Dougherty Swanson, who writes a political blog called Dana's Docket. This week we're going to talk about a few topics. So topic number one this week is looking at the fallout from the fiscal cliff. And apparently the two sides were able to get together after all at the last minute. Surprise, surprise. But nobody seems to be happy with the end result anyway. Stan, tell us about the situation now where Obama basically wants to rewrite the law to benefit him.
Well, what's happening is basically the same thing that happened last summer. It's necessary to raise the debt ceiling if the United States is to continue to borrow money to fund its government activities. Now, if it stops borrowing money, it can still pay the interest on the debt from the taxes it receives, but it would have to cut back on some 40% of its expenditures, which would be very difficult for the government to do. So there will be a raise in the debt ceiling. But the question is on what terms? The Republicans are very wisely insisting that the problem is one of spending, and if you're going to raise the debt ceiling, you must also reduce spending so that we don't keep adding to the debt and adding to the debt until we collapse the economy. Mr. Obama, on the other hand, who wants to collapse the economy so that he can become a Marxist tyrant, is refusing to consider anything of the sort and is saying, I must have the authority myself, without respect to Congress and contrary to the Constitution, to raise the debt whenever I feel like it, borrow more money in as great an amount as I want, whenever I feel like it, and once I get that, then I'll talk to you with some unspecified future date about some possibility of cutting spending and so forth, like they just cut with respect to the fiscal cliff. That is to say, they cut spending by $12 billion in reaching the fiscal cliff, in reaching the agreement on the fiscal cliff, but they increased spending by 41 times $12 billion, moving us further and further down the road toward collapse.
Dana, based on, Stan gave a very eloquent summary, but for the average person out there, what's the reality of all this?
Well, basically, like with the fiscal cliff, I mean, all of us saw our paychecks go down just recently. I mean, as of the new year.
Like $500 a person or something like that.
Well, I think it all depends between $80 to plus dollars a month. It just.
But I mean annually, like.
Annually, because the thing is, our Social Security payroll taxes increased by 2%. So that means we're taking home 2% less each month. And that was even on the money that we earned post-January, if it was the first paycheck of the year. Yeah, if it was earned in December, you got 2% less. How many of us can afford 2% less? How many Americans have not had a pay raise in years because of how bad the economy, but our income keeps getting chipped away because of, once Obamacare was passed, our health insurance went up. So that means less take-home pay. Now the Social Security payroll taxes, that means another 2% out of our paychecks. How many people are teetering on a fiscal collapse now? How many American families? And yet the government, as Stan is saying, is that Obama just wants to keep spending, spending, spending. He's not willing to make a sacrifice, but all the American people are being sacrificed.
Well, Stan, in terms of, Dana's talking about families and struggling. What about the employers? What incentive is there to invest if their taxes are going up like this? They already pay a majority of the taxes to begin with. Whether or not they have the money or not, I think doesn't really matter. The point is if they're not going to have the money to invest, if all they're going to do is be penalized by paying taxes, what's the incentive to invest?
Well, obviously what Obama is doing is harmful to employers. It's harmful to the private sector in general, but then Obama is a Marxist, and he believes in government control of the means of production, if not outright ownership, at least control. And so it doesn't disturb him philosophically.
But doesn't this also mean
that his policies are gutting what is the very core of our economic prosperity in this country? I mean, what is it doing for employers? It's forcing them to pay a great deal more money under Obamacare for their employees, for the health care. And so what they're doing is they've got lawyers too, They look at Obamacare and they say, aha, this only applies to full-time employees. So all of a sudden, so many of their full-time employees are getting their work time cut back, and now they're becoming part-time employees, which means less money for the employees, but it saves money that the employers would have had to have spent under Obamacare. They would have given to the government. No, they don't have to. But do they invest? No. The businesses in this country are sitting on some $2 trillion in investable money, which they're afraid to invest because they don't know what Obama is going to do with taxes. And they're right not to know. You would think, because Obama just won this battle with the Republicans over raising taxes only on the very wealthy and letting everyone else continue on with the Bush tax cuts, you would think he would be satisfied. Although there is a basic contradiction there, since the Democrats have been saying for several years that the Bush tax cuts were a horrible thing and were contributing to reduced revenue. And then they suddenly fought to keep those tax cuts in place for almost everybody, except for those paying about $62 billion more, enough to fund the government for about 6.5 days on an annual basis. Now that Obama has that, you would think he might be satisfied. And he might turn, if he were a responsible president, to the question of the debt ceiling, the deficit, and the overall level of debt. But he's not doing that. He is refusing to discuss that, and he is saying straight out, oh, we aren't through creating taxes. There are going to be more taxes. There's going to be more revenue. We're going to tax you indirectly, for example, by reducing various kinds of deductions and other types of things that really wealthy people use. But he will very soon figure out that there's not enough money to be gained by just reducing the deductions that the wealthy use, and then he will come after the rest of us. And we will see things like, oh, gee, I don't know, deductions for mortgage interest, which is a major supporter of the housing market in this country, go the way of all flesh.
But Democrats complain, all seem to agree, at least more recently, that the Bush tax were actually pretty good. And the second point that I want to...
That's exactly my point.
Right.
They were saying for years
well, that's what I was trying to say.
And now suddenly they're good.
But the second point I wanted to ask you about quickly is, how does this stop? I would think this would enhance or make quicker big corporations say, you know what, I'm going overseas. Why stay here with all these taxes?
And the economy will collapse even sooner, and it will fulfill
Obama's
goals.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, Henry, you have
They're
a
on
point.
the tariffs to
And
stop it.
That may well happen, because if you take a look at some of the other tax increases that he has already imposed, you see that capital gains taxes increase, taxes on income earned from dividends increase, and this is investment income. This is money that people with a little spare cash invest in companies. It's money which individuals who make quite a bit of money also invest, because tax levels are lower, but those investments are what fuel the activity of the private sector, which creates new wealth and creates jobs and basically enables our country to grow. Obama's policies are designed to prevent that. And as that happens, you're quite right, it pushes companies out of the country and to other places where the tax and permit and regulatory structure is more welcoming.
Well, Dana, if you have Obamacare, and especially next year when it'll become where you don't have to even have, you go to a hospital whether you can afford it or not, it's going to be paid for. I would think that investing overseas might be worth it more than ever, some of these big companies, non-oil companies, for, telecommunications and that kind of thing. You don't have to be based here anymore because of the global economy and the technology. What about that?
I think so, because they're going to look at America as weak and that poor investment, so go elsewhere. Go to other economies that are going to be more like America used to be, because that's where you're going to have your return on investment.
Well, we'll be back with our second segment. Okay, we're back with segment 2 with Stan Escudero and Dana Doherty Swanson. And here we're talking about the situation in Syria. Dana, over 90,000 civilians dead. countless more unaccounted for. The war seems nowhere ending in sight in Syria. Tell us about the human toll.
Well, the thing is, unfortunately, is that I think so many countries, it's like history repeats itself. You see in areas where just this mass war and death and destruction, and people forget about the humanity, and it becomes just a war zone, and people just become used to that. It's like almost violence becomes like second nature to them. I mean, that's when you get...
It's like reality TV, the videos that are coming out of there. It's so surreal.
Well, yeah, you look at like, if you ever see like the soldiers being filmed and whatnot, it's just like, I think it was someone talking Syria where they're saying, you always bring a bullet for yourself as well, because you don't want to get captured.
Stan, tell us about...
Kipling addressed that.
Stan, tell us about the efforts diplomatically to bring pressure upon Bashar al-Assad to say, you know what, your time has come, get out.
Well, that's been tried in several different ways, ineffectively by the United Nations.
What incentive is there for him to stay? Why stay on? What is there?
Because he believes, I think correctly, that if he leaves, he will find himself prosecuted for war crimes, and if those who replace him in Syria, who will not be Alawite but will be Sunni Muslims, if they ever get their hands on him or any other members of the senior Alawite rulers, they'll be executed.
But his wife is from London, England, I mean, or educated, I guess she's a native of England. Couldn't England take them, or couldn't France, or even the United States?
I suppose anybody who wanted to could offer him asylum, but I don't see us doing it, and I don't see the Brits or the French doing it. The Saudis might.
They don't want that on their territory.
But you know, once again, the man is an Alawite. He's not exactly. Now,
what's an Alawite?
Alawites are a sort of weird offshoot of Shia Islam, not Sunni Islam, and they are. Are
they the minority rule?
Oh yeah, they're a small minority of
Syria. Kind of like Saddam was.
Yeah, kind of like, but they have absolute control, or have had, of Syria for quite some time. If I were Bashar al-Assad and I were looking for a place to go, I would look to Iran. The Iranians have been the major external support of Syria throughout this revolution. They've provided arms, they've provided Pasdaran experts, fighters, and advisors for the Syrian army, and they have the most to lose. Iran, of the external countries, have the most to lose if Bashar al-Assad falls, and the Alawite rule is replaced by Sunni rule, because the Iranians, of course, are Shia.
So what's the incentive for Iran? I noticed there was a recent exchange of prisoners where 1,200 rebel soldiers were let go by the government of Syria in exchange for the rebels turning over a few dozen Iranian sort of advisors that were supposedly there on peaceful diplomatic reasons, which everyone knows is a farce. What's Iran's stake in all this?
Well, once again, Iran has worked closely with the Syrian government for decades now. They have helped to further Iranian interests in support of various terrorist groups operating out of Lebanon, primarily Hezbollah. They have also provided some assistance indirectly to Hamas and others in the Gaza Strip, from Iran through Syria to Gaza. And they have, with Syria, helped to dominate much of Lebanon ever since the Lebanese civil wars. And Iran would lose its major ally in the Arab world if Bashar al-Assad falls and is replaced by the Sunnis. But you need to consider Russia also.
Russia's a strong ally.
Russia has been the primary patron of Syria since well back into the Cold War, since the days of Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad. And
going back to the '67 Arab-Israeli war area.
Yes, exactly. And the Russians have the use of the Syrian port of Tarsus, which is a substantial naval port. This is their only real warm water port in the Mediterranean. They don't want to lose that. And they can be pretty sure, given their close relationship with the al-Assad family and with Alawite rule of Syria that the new Sunni government of Syria won't let them keep that. So they have a concern also, and that's one of the reasons why you see them in the United Nations working against fierce sanctions against the al-Assads and so forth.
Well, let me ask you this, Dana, and then you can defer to Stan if you feel it's more appropriate for him. But Israel, it's getting ramped up. At some point, Israel will discover that Iran is that much closer to nuclear capability, and they'll strike. With the situation in Syria being the way it is, does this have the potential to explode the Middle East all over, where it's just like, you know, we've got troops and equipment now in Turkey. What's the Israeli factor in all this? Is that the X factor?
My opinion, I think so, because I think Israel, I believe it used to be the United States was much more of a friend to Israel than what it is now under President Obama, and I think Israel was kind of stuck right in the middle, and unfortunately with Iran getting close to nuclear capability, I wouldn't want to be them.
What about that, Stan, as the last word?
I don't see Israel getting involved in the struggle in
But
Syria.
indirectly, if they strike Iran. Well, this
is a whole different thing. First, we're going to have to see if Netanyahu gets reelected. Assuming that he gets reelected, then I think the likelihood of an Israeli strike against Iran is good. I think that it's quite likely that Israel will strike at that time of their choosing. Whether or not they would want to let the Syrian conflict sort of provide a little cover for that.
That's what I mean.
I don't know. I couldn't.
What better timing than when everybody's?
But it would be something which they would do. After all, they said, if you remember when Netanyahu was here, and he drew that little diagram with the bomb, and they're this close and so forth. He said he thought maybe sometime between April and June.
Right.
That might be the time frame. I imagine that Mr. Netanyahu meant what he said, and that they will take a very close look at it in that time frame. And if it appears, as it must, that the Iranians are moving closer to the development of a bomb, then I think probably the Israelis will get about setting a schedule for action. But I don't think they want to get involved in the Syrian affair at all. That just takes away resources that they would use against Iran on time.
But if Israel strikes Iran, well, Iran and the rest of the Middle East, and even those superpowers, Russia and the United States, are focused on Syria. What better time to strike than when their resources are turned into there? And in effect, wouldn't it actually maybe stop what's going on in Syria?
Well, it might very well stop it, because
they'd have to redevote their resources.
Something like that could cause the Syrians to stop fighting in order to take action against Israel. I mean, the thing you have to recognize is that while the Arabs, the Muslims, are constantly at one another's throats.
There's a common enemy in Israel.
Yeah. Once Israel reaches out to swat one of them, all of them immediately turn from fighting one another and turn toward Israel. And so the Israelis are going to have to be very careful at that point. It would probably be a lot better for them if the Syrian conflict were over by the time they struck. Not to say that Israel will necessarily have a good relationship with whatever follows Bashar al-Assad, because these Sunnis are also not a single united group. And there are among them, among their warlords who are fighting Bashar, there are a number of real radical jihadists. And we cannot be sure, nobody can know at this stage, which of the members of the opposition leadership, the rebel leadership, are going to be the government, or are going to actually have the power and rule.
Well, that'll conclude section 2.